Hello everyone. Today, we're not diving into royal courts or heroic battles. We're not walking through golden halls or gazing at ancient wonders. Tonight, we're going somewhere darker, somewhere quieter, somewhere where the true drama of history happened. In the shadows of the sickbed. You see, in the Middle Ages, there was a different kind of enemy. One that didn't carry a sword or wear a crown. It crept beneath the skin, burned through the blood, and whispered in the night. It didn't announce itself with fanfare, but with a cough, a chill, a strange black spot that no one could explain. Illness in those days was not just pain. It was mystery. It was judgment. It was fear wrapped in silence. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time is it. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. So dim the lights, get comfortable. Let the noise of the day drift away. You're about to step into a world where the candlelight flickers. Not just from wind, but from the breath of someone who might not live to see morning. The Middle Ages didn't come with a warning label. People were born into it, the way one wakes up in the middle of a rainstorm. You didn't choose it. You were simply there, under grey skies, on damp streets that always smelled faintly of iron and earth and something sour that never quite faded. If you were lucky, you woke up warm. If not, the day started with a shiver that crawled up your spine like a slow-moving shadow. Disease didn't need a season. It didn't care if the sun was shining or if the harvest had been good. It appeared like a ghost, always uninvited, always leaving something behind. But before we talk about the infamous plagues, the pustules and bleeding gums, let's sit still for a moment in the ordinary dread. The background hum of a medieval day. You walk through a village, barefoot maybe, or in thin shoes that soak easily. Chickens peck at the dirt. A dog barks once, then stops, ears back. It knows something's wrong. You pass a house with the windows shut tight, too tight for a summer day. There's a smell leaking from the cracks in the wood, a mixture of lavender and something thicker. They tried. They always tried. Sprigs of rosemary, dried sage, bundles of wildflowers hung by the door. Not for beauty, for defense. Against what? Against the invisible, against the creeping. The people didn't know about bacteria. They didn't have microscopes or labs or latex gloves. But they knew. They knew when the air turned heavy. They knew when a town felt too still. They knew when the silence wasn't peaceful, but expectant. And they feared. Not like we fear today, with internet searches and urgent care clinics and over-the-counter relief. No. This fear was older, hungrier. It wrapped itself around the throat and whispered, "You might be next." Sometimes it began with a cough. Nothing strange at first, just a clearing of the throat. But the room would grow quiet. Heads would turn slightly. Eyes would narrow, just for a second. Other times it was a limp, a stagger, or the refusal to eat. And then came the sounds. Low groans, wet wheezing, muttered prayers or nonsense words, chanted over and over like a lullaby for death itself. You didn't always know what it was, but you knew what it meant. Someone wouldn't make it. In towns and villages, news travelled through silence as much as words. A shutter closed too early. A door marked with chalk. A cart wheeled out before dawn, its wheels muffled with cloth so it wouldn't wake the neighbours. The sick were often left alone, not out of cruelty, but fear, and sometimes love. Because to care for the dying was often to join them, and some mothers, some lovers, did it anyway. They sat by beds of straw, held hands that trembled, whispered stories from childhood, even when the sick no longer knew their name. There were no hospital gowns, no antiseptic rooms, just the rustle of fabric, the drip of water, the sudden silence when the moans stopped. You learned quickly to read the signs. If the skin turned pale, there was hope. If it darkened, if the fingertips blackened, the end was close. Some diseases made people burn with fever, eyes wild, thrashing, ranting about birds and angels and men with red eyes. Others made them sink into themselves, curling like dried leaves. And then there were the sudden ones, the child laughing in the morning, buried by nightfall. The man who coughed once during lunch, then collapsed before the evening bell. It wasn't just the sickness, it was the speed of it, the cruelty of being fine, and then gone. At night, the fear got louder. Lanterns flickered, dogs howled more often, and people prayed, sometimes not to live, but simply not to die like that. You see, death was a neighbour, not distant, not abstract. It shared your bread. It sat beside you at church. It waited by the stream. Children played near graves. Women gave birth knowing they might not get back up. Men returned from market wondering if the cough they heard in the next stall would follow them home. There was no clean line between healthy and not. Just the slope, slow, cruel, and irreversible. But in that darkness, there was also a strange kind of light. Not hope, at least, not in the way we use the word now, but resilience. You learned to carry grief without letting it swallow you. You found comfort in small things, a loaf that rose well, a song hummed in the dark, a breeze that smelled only of rain and not of death. You lived, not because it was easy, but because it was what you knew. And sometimes, in the middle of a sickness no one could name, someone got better. No one understood why. Maybe it was prayer. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something else. The way a single candle can push back a room full of shadows, if only for a while. So before we name the diseases, before we list their horrors, we sit here, in the hush. And remember that for every tragedy we're about to visit, there was a bed, a breath, a mother who wept, a friend who stayed. A story whispered to keep the dying calm. History isn't just kings and wars. It's the quiet terror of a house that smells wrong. It's the sound of someone coughing in the next room. It's the slow, steady courage of living when everything around you is trying to stop you. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the cool stone floor under your feet, the scent of herbs crushed under a warm cloth, the flicker of firelight on rough walls. You are not alone in this moment. Because once, long ago, someone else felt just like you do now. They were tired. They were scared. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And yet, they stayed. They survived. Their story begins here. You wake up in the middle of the night. The world outside is still, too still. Not the peaceful kind of still. Not the kind that says, rest now, you're safe. This is the kind that hums with warning, like the quiet before thunder. Like the breath someone holds before telling you something you don't want to hear. In the village, something has changed. It begins with one house. The shutters are closed even though it's warm outside. There's a bundle of herbs tied above the doorframe. Rosemary, thyme, garlic, anything to keep the invisible at bay. You hear it in whispers first, spoken behind cupped hands, passed like secrets from one mouth to another. They say it started with a merchant. They say his eyes turned red like coals. They say his skin broke out in boils the size of plums. They say he died before sundown. But worse, they say others in the house began to cough. That's when fear becomes fever. And that's when you know. The plague has returned. The Black Death. The Great Pestilence. The end of days. It went by many names, and none of them felt big enough. In the mid-14th century, it tore through Europe like a storm of death, leaving towns empty and hearts hollow. But it wasn't just one wave. It came back, again and again, like a wound that refused to close. Imagine this. You live in a village of 100 people. By the end of the month, 60 are dead, and no one knows why. They only know how it starts. A fever, a sudden pain in the groin or under the arms, a boil, a bubo, dark and swollen, as if something beneath the skin is trying to claw its way out. They burst, they bleed, and then comes the smell. It's not just rot, it's sweet almost, like spoiled fruit, like something once alive now turned against itself. People cover their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar or rose water. They burn incense, they light candles, they pray harder and faster and with voices shaking. It doesn't work. In cities, the dead are dragged out by the cartload. They ring bells as they pass, warning the living to stay inside. But the bells don't help. They only make the silence that follows even heavier. You might bury your wife in the morning and your son by nightfall. You might dig your own grave, and still, no answers. Doctors arrive in long black robes with beaked masks filled with spices and dried flowers. They look like birds from a nightmare. They speak in hushed tones and carry sticks so they don't have to touch the patients, but they can't stop it either. Theories bloom like mold. Is it the air, the stars, God's punishment, the Jews, the foreigners? People want someone to blame, because if there's a cause, there's a way to stop it. But no cause is ever clear, and no method ever works. They kill cats and dogs. They shut the city gates. They whip themselves in public, hoping pain will earn mercy. But still, the bodies pile. And it's not just the death that haunts. It's the speed of it. One day, your neighbor is laughing in the square. The next, he's begging for water, his skin streaked with blood. Mothers abandon children. Priests refuse last rites. Friends bolt their doors. The fear becomes a second plague. And yet, some stay. Not everyone runs. Some people hold hands that are already cold. They wipe the brows of the dying. They sing, not because they believe it will help, but because silence is worse. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone lives. Against every odd, against every prayer, someone survives the boils, the fever, the bleeding, and no one can explain why. In your own little cottage, you keep the windows open. You hang dried herbs over the door. You leave bread for the poor, hoping kindness might protect you. Your family stays close. You avoid the market. You boil water even when you don't know why. You watch helpless as a friend begins to cough. You wait. You wait for the fever, for the groan, for the mark on the skin. And maybe it comes, or maybe it doesn't. There's no logic to it, no pattern, just luck, or fate, or nothing. But one thing is certain, the world does not go back to what it was. After the plague, everything changes. The labourers are fewer, so their work matters more. The churches are emptier, so their power is questioned. The landowners are desperate, so they make deals they never would have made before. Graves cover fields that once held wheat. Songs are sung in minor keys. And every cough becomes a story. Even decades later, the fear lingers. You learn to flinch at the scent of vinegar. You step back when someone sneezes. You carry the memory of bells ringing in the fog. But you also carry something else. Survival, not triumph, not victory. Just the quiet fact of still being here. You light candles for the dead. You hold your child a little tighter. You listen more than you speak. And when the next plague comes, because it always comes, you will already know what to do. Not how to stop it, but how to endure. Tonight, in your soft bed, with your modern medicines and clean water and warm walls, the plague feels far away. But close your eyes, just for a moment, and remember the hush of a world that didn't know what bacteria was, that didn't have answers, that only had fear and prayer and each other. And somehow, through all of it, that was enough. You wake up hungry, not the soft kind of hunger, Not the kind that means a missed breakfast or a skipped lunch. This is the kind that crawls into your bones, makes your knees weak, your breath shallow, your thoughts foggy. It's early spring, and the stores from winter are almost gone. The fields are not yet full. The bread is darker than usual, coarse and bitter, ground from what's left at the bottom of the barrel. But it fills your stomach. That's enough, or so you think. This is how it begins, not with a cough, not with a rash, not with the bell of a death cart, but with bread. Hard, dense, slightly damp, and poisoned, though no one knows it yet. This is the disease that hides in comfort, in the one thing you trust most, food. They called it St. Anthony's fire. The name sounded almost holy, like a trial of the soul. But what it brought was not sanctity. It brought flames, not the kind you can see, but the kind you feel inside your flesh. It began subtly. A tingling in your fingers, a stiffness in the limbs, maybe a rash, red and hot to the touch. But then it spread. You could feel your fingers curl without your permission. Your legs jerked in your sleep. The burning began. From the feet up, you screamed. And no one could touch you. Not because they feared contagion, but because touching made it worse. People tore off their clothes in the snow. They ran into rivers fully clothed. They begged for ice. They prayed for death. Because in that heat, death was mercy. The culprit, a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, invisible to the naked eye, nestled in the grain, especially rye, when the fields were damp and the seasons cruel. Ergot, it blended with the flour, it baked into loaves. It was eaten with gratitude and desperation, and once inside the body, it worked its way through the blood like a curse. Some would lose fingers, toes, even whole limbs. The tissue blackened, died, and fell away. Others hallucinated, wild visions of beasts, of angels, of impossible landscapes. Some claimed to fly, others claimed to see demons in their beds. Children cried out in voices that weren't their own. Women wept without knowing why. Men danced in the streets until they collapsed. No one understood it. Doctors blamed spirits. Priests blamed sin. Mothers blamed the cold or the grain or themselves. There were no answers, just the fire. Hospitals run by monks tried to help. They offered baths, herbs, prayers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But oddly, and no one knew why at the time, those who were taken in by the monks often recovered. The reason? Simple. They stopped eating rye. The monks fed them wheat bread, clean, uncontaminated, and the fire inside them dimmed. But in the villages, far from the monasteries, the outbreaks continued. The poor had no choice. When the grain went bad, they used it anyway. Mouldy rye was still better than no bread at all. And so, generation after generation, the fire returned. It didn't spread like the plague. It didn't kill as quickly, but it haunted the countryside like a ghost, silent, invisible, and cruel. You imagine now you're 10 years old. You've never known a feast. Bread and onions, maybe cheese if you're lucky. A little ale, that's dinner. One morning, your fingers feel stiff. By nightfall, you're screaming. Your mother weeps. She thinks you're possessed. The priest comes. He reads over your body, but you can't hear him. Not over the roaring in your mind. You see colours that don't exist. You feel as if your bones are made of firewood. You try to walk, but your legs betray you. Your body no longer belongs to you. And still, you are hungry. Sometimes it ended. The visions faded. The limbs stopped twitching. The fever passed. But other times, the fire took too much. It burned until the hands could no longer hold. It burned until the feet could no longer walk. It burned until the mind snapped, quietly, like a twig. And all that was left was silence. Years later, long after the worst of it, some stories remained. Tales of the dancing plague. People overcome by motion, moving until they dropped, of nuns who claimed to be cats, of entire villages struck by madness. Now we know some of those stories were likely caused by ergot poisoning, ergotism, madness from bread. And yet, bread was sacred. The church said so. The people believed it. To break bread was to live another day. To bake bread was to care for your family. No one suspected it could also kill. Today, we understand more. We have clean agriculture, science, knowledge. We know how to test flour, how to identify fungus, how to treat symptoms. But back then, they had only faith and fire. So when you next bite into a piece of warm, clean, buttered bread, remember them. The children who shook, the mothers who screamed, the monks who fed strangers with soft wheat loaves, and the families who burned from within, never knowing why. The breath of death didn't always come with a cough. Sometimes it came warm from the oven. Sometimes it tasted like home. And that, in a way, was the cruelest trick of all. You were not born a leper. No one ever is. It starts small. A patch of skin, a little too pale. A finger that tingles and doesn't quite feel right. Maybe it goes numb when you touch cold water. You shake it off, like any peasant would. Life is already full of aches and bruises. You have animals to feed, roofs to patch, firewood to split. A tingle is nothing, until it's not. In the Middle Ages, disease didn't always come fast and loud like the plague. Sometimes it arrived slowly, patiently, like a stranger knocking politely at your door every day, until one morning you wake up and realize it's already inside. Leprosy was like that. Not the biblical lightning bolt of divine punishment, not the sudden horror of coughing blood or vomiting black bile. No, leprosy was slow, methodical. It took away who you were one nerve at a time, and the world watched it happen, step by step. You begin to notice more. Your foot drags a little when you walk. Your face feels strange. Not painful, just distant, like it belongs to someone else. The patch on your hand doesn't hurt when it's burned. The smell of rot? You didn't even notice it was coming from you. You ask a neighbor, "Do I look different?" She doesn't answer. She just looks away. The next day, the priest knocks on your door. He doesn't come in. Diagnosis wasn't given in a whisper. It was public, loud, final. The church would sometimes hold a ritual, the Mass of the Living Death. Because that's what it was. You were declared spiritually dead. You weren't executed. You weren't imprisoned. You were simply removed. There was no cure, no coming back. You were given a robe, long, hooded. You were handed a wooden clapper or a small bell to warn people when you approached. And then, they led you out of the village. No goodbyes, no final embrace. You were gone. Some walked for days before finding refuge. Others collapsed in ditches. But a few reached the leper colonies, places not of healing, but of waiting. Leprosariums. Walled, isolated, forgotten. Sometimes cared for by monks or nuns, sometimes not. Here, the world was different, slower. You shared space with others whose hands curled like claws, whose noses had collapsed into sunken pits, whose voices rasped, not from sickness, but from isolation. Lepers did not die quickly. That was the cruelty of it. You lived, and watched yourself fade. Touch was a memory. Once, someone held your hand. Once, your mother kissed your forehead. Once, your child curled up beside you. Now, you heard footsteps retreat when you entered. You saw fear in strangers' eyes. Even kindness came from a distance. Food left at the edge of the field, messages tied to rocks. And yet, you still lived. Inside the colony, people still sang. They carved wood. They painted, read scriptures, told stories of their youth. You learn to live with silence, to speak in softer tones, to value sunlight through a small window, and sometimes to fall in love again. Even among those cast out, humanity refused to die. But leprosy did not spare the spirit. It mocked it. The disease deformed the face, took the symmetry, the expressiveness, the humanness. Your smile faded, not from sadness, but because the muscles simply stopped working. Your voice changed, your posture bent. You became, in the eyes of others, less you. And that may have hurt more than the sores. Fear of leprosy went beyond pain. People thought it was punishment, proof of sin. Maybe your parents sinned. Maybe you did. Maybe it was lust, or pride, or simply bad luck. They didn't understand bacteria, but they understood shame, and they carried it with them, generation after generation. But what they missed, what we forget, is that leprosy didn't take the mind. You still thought, still felt, still dreamed. You remembered the smell of your home. You imagined your daughter's wedding. You prayed, sometimes not for healing, but for memory, to keep your sense of self as your body forgot it. Outside the colonies, lepers haunted imagination. In paintings, they were monsters. In sermons, warnings. In laws, exiled. But inside the walls, they were just people. Farmers, bakers, lovers, children, scholars. People who once danced at feasts. People who now watch the seasons change from the same patch of earth. Some were born there, raised among the slow, taught to ring the bell before entering a room, taught to eat last, speak gently, and never expect a stranger's kindness. And yet, they grew, not wild, not cruel, but quietly strong. Not all lepers were poor. Some were once noble, rich, educated. Leprosy didn't care. It took the prince and the peasant alike. It did not kill fast. And that, in a way, made it more brutal, because it asked you to live with it, to watch yourself change, to accept exile, to hold on to the last thread of your identity, even when your hands could no longer hold. And yet, through it all, some found peace. They learned to listen to the wind, to speak with birds, to laugh without needing teeth, to walk slowly and still feel the earth beneath their feet. They became storytellers, healers of wounds that weren't theirs, keepers of silence. So now, in your warm bed, with your skin untouched, your hands steady, your reflection whole, remember them. Not as symbols, not as sinners, as people, people who lost everything but breath, and still breathed. In the stillness of night, they lived. They were banished, but never vanished. They were feared, but never unworthy. They were forgotten, and that is what we correct tonight, by remembering, by telling their story, by feeling for a moment what it meant to live in slow motion, and still call it life. There were days when the sky seemed to press lower. The birds didn't sing. The breeze didn't move. The air felt thick, like wet wool pressed to the skin. People didn't say it aloud, but they all felt it. Something was coming. Not a storm, not a war. Something quieter and far more dangerous. It started the way most illnesses did, subtly. A child too tired to play. A farmer who overslept. A merchant who forgot where he was for a moment. But this wasn't the plague. Not the fiery, terrifying scream of death that came with black boils and rotting skin. No. This was something else, something without a name. In the Middle Ages, not all sicknesses came with pageantry. Some crept in, nameless and unknowable, like whispers in a dream. The doctors had words for them. Tertian fever, quotidian chills, catarrh. But those were labels made of fog. They meant nothing. They explained nothing. All the villagers knew was that the body grew hot, then cold, then hot again, and then wrong. You might wake up feeling fine, a little tired perhaps. But that's every morning, isn't it? You eat, you dress, you stretch your arms, and something pulls. Your bones ache. By midday, your hands shake. By evening, your eyes sting, and you can't stop shivering, even under thick wool. You sweat through your sheets. You mutter strange things in your sleep. You see a light in the corner that isn't there. No one could agree on what it was. Malaria, typhoid, a viral hemorrhagic fever. They didn't know these names. They called it the bone fire or the ghost sickness. Sometimes it came with a rash. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it passed after a day. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it killed. But always, it lingered. People saw patterns. They thought it followed the moon, or came with the fog, or slipped in through the cracks of closed doors. The poor were blamed, or the rich, or the baker with the strange eyes, because if you couldn't name it, at least you could blame it. Superstition filled the gaps science hadn't yet reached. They said if the chickens stopped laying, sickness would come. If the dogs howled all night, someone would die. If the fire in the hearth cracked 3 times in a row, run. They listened to dreams, to birds, to the wind. And they were not wrong to do so, because when logic fails, pattern is all we have. And yet, amid all the guessing, some truths were real. Stagnant water bred illness. Bad air made lungs burn. Rotten meat twisted the gut. They didn't know the words. Bacteria, parasite, virus. But they knew the feel of sickness. They knew its scent, its rhythm. And they feared it, even when it came softly. Some fevers took your mind, not permanently, but enough to leave you uncertain. You'd forget a name. You'd forget your own. You'd cry in your sleep and not know why. And when you recovered, if you recovered, the world felt slightly off, as if it had shifted while you were away. There were healers who claimed to understand. They brewed teas of willow bark and nettle. They tied herbs to your wrists, whispered prayers in Latin or older tongues. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the warmth of a hand, the calm of a chant, the promise of you will be well, sometimes that was enough to carry a body through the worst of it. And then there were the ones who didn't recover. They faded slowly, eating less each day. Their skin grew grey, their words slurred. Their hands trembled at rest. They saw things in the corners of rooms. They spoke to people no one else could see. And then, one night, they stopped breathing. No violence, no drama, just silence. And maybe that was the worst of it. The quiet deaths, the unnamed ones, the ones that left no mark on the skin, only on the memory. For woe. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about houses touched by these fevers. They lit candles at doorways, hung charms made from straw and twine, painted crosses above beds. They avoided eye contact with those recently ill, not out of cruelty, but fear. What if the sickness wasn't done yet? What if it could return? Because it often did. The thing about nameless sicknesses is that they don't follow rules. They skip over the old and take the strong. They spare the child and take the mother. They vanish for a season, only to return when the crops are ripe. They make you doubt what's real. Is that sweat from the heat? Or the beginning? Is this yawn from fatigue? Or the first sign? The fear of these unknown fevers etched itself into the culture, into lullabies, into prayers, into the way people looked at you when you coughed. Even centuries later, in stories passed down, you can hear the echo of that dread. Don't sleep with your feet uncovered. The fever will find you. Always drink nettle tea in spring. It keeps the ghosts away. If you see 3 crows in the morning, stay inside all day. Today, we might call those stories folklore, but back then, they were medicine. Because when knowledge is absent, Story is survival. Now, as you lie warm in your bed, your breath steady, your skin cool, imagine them. Those who lived on the edge of certainty, who woke each day unsure whether their body would betray them, who didn't know the name of what they feared, only that they feared it deeply. Some fevers passed without consequence, others marked you forever, but all of them reminded you the body is fragile, a miracle, yes, but a trembling one, and sometimes just surviving another day was the greatest triumph of all. So breathe in now, slowly. Feel the quiet safety of the moment, and let the stories of those unknown fevers drift softly into the night. You glance down at your reflection in the water. It's not the same face you remember. There's a darkness under your eyes that wasn't there last spring, a thickness in your lips, a crack in your skin. Your nose seems flatter, or maybe it's just swollen. You're not sure anymore. Your body aches in strange places, not like a bruise or a fall, but something deeper, inside the joints, beneath the bones. You stretch your fingers and the skin feels too tight, like it's trying to hold in something that wants to break out. You cough, but nothing comes. And then you catch a glimpse of your reflection again. And this time, you almost don't recognize yourself. In the medieval world, disease wasn't just something that visited you. It became you. It transformed your body from something familiar into something strange. And perhaps no illness did that more cruelly than syphilis, but it wasn't called that yet. To the people of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, it was known as the Great Pox, or the French disease, or the Spanish disease, depending on who you hated most at the time. It spread quickly, and it left marks. Imagine this. You're young, maybe 22. You've just started working in the city. There's a woman, or a man. You share a drink, a smile, a bed, and a few weeks later, the pain begins. At first it's manageable, a sore, small, it goes away. You think it's nothing. But then come the chills, the rash, the aching legs that don't let you sleep. You think it's a cold, but your hair starts to fall out. Your voice changes, your face begins to swell, your skin flakes, cracks, bleeds, and when you smile, people flinch. Syphilis was not quick, it was slow, it was theatrical, and it loved to perform. It danced through the body in stages, each one more devastating than the last. First came the sore, then the rash, then the bones began to warp, then the madness. It ate from within. Joints swelled until walking became a grimace. Flesh fell away from the nose. Teeth loosened. The forehead expanded. The skull thickened, as if the disease was carving its own monument in bone. People feared it, yes, but they were also fascinated by it. Doctors studied it obsessively, poking, charting, describing it in painful detail, and artists painted it. You'd see saints with rotting faces, martyrs with bulbous limbs, Christ surrounded by syphilitic beggars. It wasn't just sickness, it became metaphor. And the shame? Unbearable. Because syphilis was a disease of contact, of desire, of secrecy. People whispered names behind hands, accused each other, lied. But the body never lied. It betrayed you in every gesture, every glance, every missed step on a cobbled street. In some towns, syphilitics were made to wear special garments. Others were locked in hospitals, not for healing, but for hiding. The disease became a class issue. The poor were blamed, the rich were pitied, but both suffered. You see it now in old texts, lists of symptoms so vivid they seem poetic in their horror. Lumps like walnuts, eyes that see fire but not faces, voices like crumbling stone, descriptions of bodies bloated with sores, of minds unraveling thread by thread. And yet, people kept living. Because the body is not just pain, it is memory. And even when twisted, it remembers how to endure. People walked with canes, covered their faces with scarves, wrote poems with hands that shook. Some sought cure in mercury. Deadly, yes, but desperate. They painted it on their skin, inhaled its vapors, drank it in teas, and many died faster from the cure than the curse. Still, there were moments of beauty. A musician with missing fingers still played a tune. A lover kissed a scarred cheek and meant it. A mother with shaking hands still held her child close. Because the body may become a map of pain, but even maps can lead to meaning. We think of the past as distant, primitive, but stand in front of an old mirror and imagine your face marked not by years, but by disease, your hands trembling not with age, but with infection, your name whispered not in love, but in warning. And still, you wake, you dress, you walk into the world, not because you feel strong, but because it's morning. And the bread needs baking, and someone has to do it. There were those who painted over their sores with makeup, who lit candles not to pray, but to hide their trembling in the flickering light, who wrote letters they never sent, explaining a disease they couldn't name. And there were those who chose silence, who sat by the fire and listened to the world forget them. But the body remembers. Every limp, every gasp, every touch that lingered too long or not long enough. It remembers the day your skin betrayed you, and the day someone held you anyway. So now, lying still, with clean sheets and a quiet room, let your breath slow. Feel your hands, your face, the quiet beat of your heart. Think of those whose bodies became strange to them, who found themselves slowly changing in the mirror, and who still tried to live with dignity. History remembers kings and battles, but it forgets those who woke up different, who carried pain without names, who loved even as they were unloved, who stood in crowds knowing their own body was writing its own ending. They did not ask to be remembered, but tonight we do, in softness, in stillness, in truth. For even when the body becomes a map of pain, it is still a map. It still leads somewhere, and sometimes it leads home. There are days when the light begins to change. It's not just the sun dipping behind the hills, or the way fog settles into the village at dusk. It's something quieter, more personal, like the world itself is pulling back, receding from your vision one blurred outline at a time. You squint, you blink, and still, the details don't come. The edge of the candle flame feels fuzzier. The familiar road seems unfamiliar. The stars no longer sparkle the way they used to. You rub your eyes. You wash your face in cold water. You pray, perhaps, but nothing clears the haze. In the Middle Ages, blindness wasn't just a condition. It was a fate. And more often than not, it didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, like dusk stretching across a sky that once held daylight. For many, the descent into darkness was slow, gradual, inescapable. It began with difficulty seeing at night, then shadows during the day. Then the outlines of faces began to blur, and soon your world was a watercolor left out in the rain. They called it nyctalopia, night blindness, or just the dimming. It wasn't dramatic. No blood, no boils, no screams. But for those who suffered from it, it was just as terrifying. Because when you lose your sight, you lose your place in the world. It often began with hunger, not the sharp, desperate kind, but the silent kind. The slow starvation of vital things, of nutrients we now call vitamins, especially one, vitamin A. Back then, no one knew what that meant. They only knew that during the long winters, The food was bland. Bread, ale, maybe dried beans, if you were lucky. The occasional onion or apple if it hadn't rotted. But fat, meat, fresh greens, rare, especially for the poor. And without those, the eyes suffered. The strange thing about vision is how we assume it. Even in darkness, we believe in shapes. We recognize voices. We orient ourselves by touch. But when your eyes begin to betray you, the betrayal is subtle and deeply personal. The lamp seems dimmer, but only to you. The stars vanish, but no one else notices. And soon, you stop walking at night. You miss steps. You trip. You hesitate. Children were especially vulnerable. A young boy who squinted too often. A girl who tilted her head at strange angles to see better. At first, they were scolded, then pitied, and then forgotten. Because what can a blind child do? They can't work the fields. They can't read, if they ever learned. They can't fetch water or tend to animals. They sit and listen and fade. But blindness wasn't always total. That's what made it cruel. Many could still see, a little, just enough to remember what was lost. The way sunlight used to sparkle on a stream, the smile of a mother, the soft glow of firelight on wood beams, now replaced by shadows, shadows that flickered and shifted, always just out of reach. The church spoke of blindness in metaphors, blind faith, the blind leading the blind, blindness as punishment, as virtue, as mystery. And in that, perhaps, there was a strange kind of comfort. Because if God made you blind, maybe he saw something others couldn't. Maybe your blindness meant vision of a different kind. But for the blind, the metaphors didn't help. They still stumbled, still ached, still needed hands to guide them. Some communities helped. They taught the blind to spin wool by touch, to sort beans by feel, to listen better, to survive, not to thrive, not in the way we use that word today, but to persist. And in a world that moved by the strength of your limbs and the clarity of your eyes, persistence was no small feat. For others, blindness was the result of disease, infections left untreated, small injuries that festered, smoke from too many hearths in enclosed spaces, cataracts that clouded the eye like milk poured over glass. They had no surgeries, no lenses, no correction, only herbs, compresses, prayers, and time. The blind were sometimes mocked, sometimes revered, bards, prophets, fools. They lived in a liminal space, between mystery and pity. They were called wise, even when they were hungry. They were called holy, even when they begged. And yet, some found peace. Because when the world fades to shadow, the other senses rise. The scent of earth after rain, the sound of bread crust cracking, the warmth of a cat curling at your feet, the softness of a child's hand in yours, the rhythm of a story told by someone who still sees. Many blind people became keepers of memory, because memory does not require eyes. It requires silence, listening, repetition. They passed down tales by word, held songs in their breath, wove histories from touch. In the monasteries, some monks blinded by age still whispered prayers by heart, their voices steady, even when their steps were not. In villages, blind elders sat near fires and spoke of winters long gone, of faces no one remembered, but them, their minds sharp, their hearts open, their eyes useless, but not their presence. In some ways, blindness stripped away the illusion of control. You couldn't read the clouds or measure the angle of the sun. You couldn't plan, only move forward, step by cautious step. And in that slowness, there was something sacred. It's hard to say if they felt that, if those who lost their sight found peace, or only pain. But what we know is this: they endured. And in enduring, they left behind not paintings or books, but presence. A blind woman who could feel illness in your wrist. A blind boy who always knew which herbs to pick by smell. A blind elder who never forgot the sound of his mother's laugh. So tonight, as you blink and stretch, your vision still crisp and whole, think of them, of those who watched their world dim, who never saw their children's faces grow old, who spoke of colour like a dream, and who still found ways to live. The Middle Ages did not offer comfort for the blind, no braille, no guides, no systems, but in the hush of darkness they still found beauty, and meaning, and each other. Because even when God's eyes were blind, the human heart was not. It still reached out, still found, still saw. And so do you. Now, in the stillness, in the dark, with your eyes closed, and the world held softly in memory. There are sounds in a village that belong to every morning, the clatter of pails at the well, the distant murmur of animals waking in their pens, the sharp hiss of fire catching in a hearth. But sometimes, among those daily rhythms, you hear another sound, quieter, slower, a kind of uneven scuffing along the dirt. It's the sound of a child walking strangely, a limp, a dragging foot, the shuffle of legs that don't quite match in length. And for a brief moment, everyone around pretends not to notice, but they do. In the Middle Ages, to be born different was to be born marked. Not by God, they said, but by sin, or sorcery, or a punishment that belonged to the parents. Children who grew twisted, bowed, shrunken. They were seen not as medical mysteries, but as signs, and signs were feared. The illness wasn't named back then. Today we call it rickets, a disease of poverty, of shadow, of hunger. A disease that robbed bones of strength, made limbs curve instead of stretch, made skulls bulge and chests sink. Its cause was invisible, a lack of sunlight, a deficiency in something no one knew existed, vitamin D. But back then, they had only their eyes, and their shame. Imagine being born in a stone cottage with little light. Your mother swaddles you tightly to keep out the chill. You're breastfed as long as possible, but she's weak too. Her milk thin, her body drained by too many winters and too few meals. You grow, but not as the others do. At 6 months, your legs don't bear weight. At a year, you wobble too much. At 2, your forehead seems too large, your chest too soft. You cry at night, from pain, though no one yet calls it that. Your parents try. They rub your legs with oil. They sit you in sun patches when they can. They whisper prayers. But still, you grow slower, curved, bent, fragile. And in a world where survival depended on strength, you were left behind. The other boys lifted buckets. You carried spoons. The girls ran through fields. You sat on stones and watched. You learned to smile through pain, to laugh before they laughed at you, to make yourself small when you couldn't make yourself straight. The whispers came quickly. He's touched. She was born under a cursed moon. They didn't bless the child in time. And worse, it's the mother's fault. Always the mother. Some children with rickets survived into adulthood. Their bones hardened, though never properly. Their bodies remained marked. Bowed legs, pigeon chests, short stature, oddly shaped skulls. They worked if they could, weaving, fetching, sorting, but always slower, always on the edge. And then there were the ones who didn't survive. Because rickets wasn't just a crooked back or a waddling gait. It weakened the rib cage, made breathing shallow. It softened the spine, made walking agony. It distorted the pelvis, made childbirth a death sentence. It made life a daily negotiation with pain. And in the absence of understanding, that pain was called other things: possession, punishment, pity. They weren't taught to read. They weren't shown the stars. They were often left behind when the village moved, the fields flooded, the harvest failed. Not out of cruelty, but calculus. One less mouth, one less burden, one more sacrifice to a hard world. And yet, some survived and lived long lives. They became the watchers, the listeners, the ones who could predict rain by the ache in their bones, the ones who remembered every season because they watched each one pass, seated on the same bench. They told stories to the young, wove baskets that never came undone, found meaning in the stillness others fled. Because the truth is this: children who cannot run learn to see. They notice the way light shifts on leaves. They remember the tone of someone's voice better than their words. They build inner worlds so vast they could contain whole empires. And in those inner worlds, they ruled. Their pain was not noble. It did not teach a lesson, but it shaped them, made them precise, careful, wise in a way that does not show in muscles, but in silence. Some families hid their crooked children. Others put them on display. A miracle, a curse, a warning. They were used, praised one moment, feared the next, but rarely asked what they felt. And so tonight, as you stretch your legs and feel the strength in your bones, pause. Think of the child who never walked without pain, who never climbed a tree but could name every leaf on it, who sat still day after day and still felt the seasons pass. Think of the mother who rocked that child, even when others said not to bother, who sang songs as if they could straighten bones, who hoped anyway. We remember kings and warriors, but we forget the crooked ones, the ones who limped through life and still loved it, who built stories instead of walls, who survived, not by winning, but by waiting. Rickets may seem like a disease of the poor, the forgotten, the far away. But it is also a story of shadowed rooms, of hunger, of tenderness, of children who grew in strange shapes and still carried joy in their hands. Tonight, let them walk through your dreams, not as symbols, but as children, as they were, bent, but not broken. Because even a crooked tree bears fruit, and even a crooked child carries light. It always started with something so ordinary, a headache, a sore back. The feeling that perhaps you worked too hard the day before, carrying buckets, walking through the damp, bending too long in the fields. Nothing to fear, at least, not yet. But then came the fever, a heat that rolled through the body like a slow fire. You'd toss under the wool blankets, soaking them. Your skin would feel too tight. Your thoughts would run in circles. And when morning came, it was worse. The pain had burrowed deeper, and a new symptom had arrived. Small red dots. Just a few. Scattered like pinpricks across the belly, the chest, the arms. At first you might still hope. Maybe it's just a rash. Maybe it's heat. Maybe it's nothing. It's never nothing. Smallpox had many names before science gave it one. The Red Death, the Speckled Monster, the Burning Skin. But no name ever truly captured it. Because this disease didn't just kill. It marked. It scarred. It changed you. You could survive smallpox and still be unrecognizable. To others, and to yourself. That was part of its cruelty. It didn't always take your life. Sometimes it just took your face. The rash began to blister. The blisters filled with a thick yellowish fluid. They swelled. They spread. Each one hot to the touch, like tiny furnaces erupting from beneath your skin. You couldn't lie on your back. You couldn't touch your own arm without pain. Your eyelids swelled shut. Your lips cracked. Even the inside of your throat blistered, making swallowing agony. And there were no bandages soft enough. No cloth that didn't stick. No relief. People were terrified. Not just of dying, though many did, but of what the disease left behind. Deep, cratered scars. a face that looked like the moon in shadow, blindness from corneal scarring, deformed limbs in children who caught it too young, and of course, the stigma. Because even if you lived, you never looked the same again. In medieval Europe, a smallpox outbreak was like a bad harvest. It ruined everything. It swept through towns, killing children first, then the old, then, unpredictably, the strong. Some families lost every child in a single week. Others buried a father and a daughter in the same grave. It spared no one based on rank or virtue. Monks, queens, farmers, merchants, all blistered the same way. And the sound of the sick. It was unforgettable. Not the coughing of the plague. Not the cries of the leper, but moaning, endless. A low, rhythmic, almost animal sound. Not from the mouth, but from the body itself, trying to weep through the skin. They tried what they could. Herbs, honey on the sores, cold cloths, prayers whispered into fevered ears, some burned sweet-smelling wood, hoping to drive the evil spirits away. Others avoided the sick entirely. They boarded up houses, left bowls of food at the edge of the village, and hoped. Children feared the scars more than the sickness, especially girls. In a world where beauty could mean survival, in marriage, in work, in basic dignity, a scarred face was a lifetime sentence of side glances and pity. You might live, but you'd never be whole again. And then, in rare cases, smallpox would go inward. It would invade the blood too deeply, spread too fast. People bled from the gums, from the nose, from beneath the fingernails. The pustules would merge into one great mass, a sheet of infection. Death came swiftly, and the body looked almost burned. These cases were often buried quickly, or not at all. But somehow, some survived. And not just survived, thrived. Because surviving smallpox was like being forged in fire. You were immune after that. Forever. That was something people knew, even if they didn't understand the why. And so survivors became midwives, caretakers, healers who could approach the infected without fear. Their faces, marked by craters, became symbols of strength, of endurance, of having walked through flame and come out the other side. We forget sometimes what it means to carry a disease in your skin, to have every face-to-face meeting start with an unspoken, "What happened to you?" To know that your history is visible, to live without anonymity, to be a walking reminder of pain and of survival. There were stories of lovers who still kissed scarred cheeks, of mothers who cradled blistered children with hands trembling from memory, of friendships that deepened in sickness. Because when you have nothing left but your voice, your story matters more. And that's what many of them became. Storytellers, the marked, the scarred, the ones who knew what it was to be seen differently, and yet insisted on being seen anyway. So now, under your blanket, with your soft skin untouched, your breath even and cool, think of them. The girls who watched their beauty melt away. The boys who came back from the brink, blind in one eye and stronger than before. The parents who prayed not for safety, but for survival with grace. The Middle Ages did not have vaccines, no antiseptic, no explanation, but they had endurance and a strange, defiant hope. Not that everything would be okay, but that you could live, even when it wasn't. Smallpox doesn't scar us now, not physically, but it shaped our history, our medicine, our compassion. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the memory of those faces, cratered, radiant, brave, rest with you. They were not beautiful in the old sense. They were something better. They were proof. Proof that suffering is not the end of the story. Sometimes, it's the beginning. You wake to the sound of bells, but not the ones that mark the morning. These bells are fast, panicked. Someone is shouting in the square. You rise, confused, still tangled in sleep. And then you hear it. Music. Not sweet, not joyful, but frantic. Violins scraping too quickly, drums pounding in no rhythm at all, and the sound of footsteps. Hundreds of them, but not walking, not marching, dancing. It's not a festival day. There's no wedding. And yet the people are dancing. Mothers. Children. Old men. Shoes fly from feet. Faces drip with sweat. Some people laugh as they move, their mouths wide open in joyless smiles. Others sob, and others don't seem to be aware of anything at all. They just move, twitching, jerking, twisting, as if their limbs no longer obey them. This is not a play. It is not theatre. It is a sickness, one with no name, no cause, and no mercy. We call it today dancing mania or choreomania. But back then, it was a curse, a punishment. A mystery as terrifying as it was contagious. It appeared in waves across Europe, Germany, France, the Low Countries, sometimes in a village, sometimes a whole city. A crowd would gather and begin to move, not together, not to music, but to something no one else could hear. Imagine your brother begins to twitch. First his fingers, then his legs. He laughs, but it doesn't sound like his laughter. It sounds hollow. You try to hold him, but he breaks free, runs into the street, and begins to dance. There are no steps to this dance. It's all arms and knees and jolts and falls. People collapse, foam at the mouth, rise again. Some scream scripture, others speak in tongues. Some begin stripping as if their skin burns. A few fall dead, hearts bursting from exhaustion. And the worst part, you want to look away, but something in you wants to join. The church blames sin. Doctors blame overheated blood, hysteria, divine wrath. Some say it's possession. Others say it's grief, because the plague has passed, but barely. And what's left in its wake? Bodies, yes, but also minds, torn by loss, shredded by fear. So maybe the dancing is not a disease. Maybe it is a language of pain, of protest, of too much sorrow in too little space. They tried to cure it. Musicians were hired to play and exhaust the dancers. They believed that if the music stopped, the souls would scream louder. So they played and played until the fiddlers collapsed too. In some towns, dancing platforms were built, wooden stages where the afflicted could flail safely, away from others. Doctors stood nearby taking notes. Children watched in silence. Sometimes they danced too. What caused it? We still don't know. Ergot poisoning, perhaps. The same fungus that caused hallucinations. Or maybe a form of mass psychogenic illness, collective hysteria. Or trauma, echoing across minds like wind, across empty rooms. But for those who lived it, those explanations don't matter. All they knew was this: the body betrayed them. Not with pain, but with motion. Not with stillness, but with frenzy. And worst of all, it felt impossible to stop. Imagine your daughter twirling in the square, barefoot, her skin raw from falling. You call her name. She doesn't hear. Or maybe she hears, but doesn't know what the name means anymore. And so you wait. You sit on the steps and watch her dance into the night. And you pray, not for healing, but for rest. Because that was the end, for many. Not recovery, just collapse. Not death from disease, but from exhaustion. They danced themselves to death. Later, people built shrines to saints who were said to cure the afflicted. Saint Vitus, Saint John. They held processions, wore red garments, touched relics, and for a while, it helped. Not because of magic, but because of hope. Because believing that something could stop the madness was better than thinking it might return. And yet, return it did. again and again through the centuries. A wave of strange behavior sweeping through a population like wind through tall grass. And then gone. No trace. No cause. Only stories. We think of illness as physical. Something that bleeds, swells, breaks. But the mind has its own fevers, its own plagues, its own dance. In the Middle Ages, they didn't have psychiatry, no diagnoses, no treatment, but they had eyes, and hearts, and fear. And when they saw a village moving as one, laughing and crying and twisting under invisible strings, they knew something was wrong, even if they didn't have the words. So tonight, in your still body, under your warm blanket, let your breath be slow, your limbs steady, your heartbeat gentle, and remember those who could not stop moving, who danced not in joy but in surrender, to grief, to fear, to something we may never understand. They were not mad, they were not possessed, they were tired of silence, tired of sorrow, tired of waiting for answers that never came. And sometimes, when the soul breaks, it does not scream. It dances. The pain doesn't come all at once. At first, it's just a sting when you bite into something hot. Maybe a sweetness in the breath that shouldn't be there. Not the pleasant kind, but a sour sweet that curls in the back of the throat. Then comes the swelling, the aching when you chew, the tenderness in the gums. You run your tongue along your teeth, and something feels wrong. A wobble, a sharp edge, a place where the tooth has split like old wood. You try to ignore it, because in the Middle Ages, a toothache was never just a toothache. It was the beginning of something much worse. The medieval mouth was not a peaceful place. It was a battlefield, a cave of bone and decay, of swollen tissue and bleeding gums. Dentistry, as we know it, did not exist. There were no toothbrushes, no floss, no anesthetic, only pain. And, if you were lucky, someone to pull the problem out, quickly. If not, it stayed, it festered, it spread. Imagine this. You're a blacksmith. Your hands are strong, your back steady, but your mouth betrays you. A molar cracks. At first, it just hurts when you bite. Then, always. Then, even at night. You cannot eat meat anymore. Then you cannot eat bread. Then, even water is agony. Your jaw swells. Your face distorts. And then, the fever begins. This isn't an infection of the gums anymore. It's an abscess, a pocket of pus and poison, pressing against nerves, drilling pain into your skull. Your ear throbs. Your eye waters. You can't sleep. You can't speak clearly. You can barely think. The infection spreads. Down the neck, into the chest, sometimes into the brain. And then, sepsis. You're not coughing blood. You're not covered in boils, but you are dying. From a tooth. It's hard to believe, from the comfort of the modern world, that something so small could kill. But in the medieval world, dental infection was lethal. And worse, it was common. Tooth decay was not rare, even in a world without sugar as we know it. Grains ground with stone left microscopic grit in bread, wearing teeth down. Meat, when available, was often tough. People used their teeth for everything, cracking nuts, pulling thread, holding tools. There was no relief. No dental hygiene beyond occasional rinses with herbs or vinegar. No cleanings, no extractions, unless by force. And yet, teeth mattered. A smile, even a crooked, stained one, was a sign of health, of strength, of youth. When teeth began to rot, people noticed. They stepped back, because the smell, the rot, was unmistakable. Breath like decay, like meat left out too long, like something inside was dying. There were remedies, of course, cloves, chewed for their numbing effect, honey and salt, packed into the cavity, burned rosemary smoke, inhaled through the mouth, Even wine swished until the pain dulled, or the mind did. But they were not cures, only delays. If you were lucky, a barber surgeon might remove the offending tooth. With iron tongs, no anesthesia, just force and pain, the kind that made you scream so loud the animals fled. If the tooth broke mid-extraction, too bad. You'd carry the shards forever. Some chose not to pull. They lived with it. They became quiet, withdrawn, chewed on one side only, ate slowly, with a hand covering their mouth. They whispered more than they spoke, laughed less, and sometimes faded from company altogether, because nothing isolates like constant pain. And yet, they endured. They kept working, feeding children, mending clothes, praying, even as their mouths became battlegrounds of agony. For some, the worst came not from infection, but from jaw disease, osteomyelitis, gangrene of the face, or worse, cancrum oris, a terrifying condition that ate away at the mouth itself, often in children weakened by other illnesses. The skin blackened, the flesh decayed, holes appeared in cheeks and lips, and the victim, if they lived, was left disfigured for life. But the most common pain was the quiet one. Gingivitis, tooth loss, jaw stiffness, TMJ from grinding under stress, and no one could help. Mothers massaged their children's gums with ash and honey. Wives boiled herbs for husbands who couldn't chew anymore. Old women blessed with strong teeth became midwives and healers, guarding their secret like gold. Some cultures believed that tooth pain came from toothworms, tiny creatures burrowing inside the enamel. They burned incense near the mouth, hoping to smoke the worm out. Others tied twine around a painful tooth and yanked, or heated metal and applied it directly to the gum. The logic was always the same. Better agony now than death later. And sometimes it worked. The tooth came out. The fever broke. The person recovered. But they never forgot. Because even when the pain ended, the gap remained. The missing piece. The reminder. We take our teeth for granted now. We clean them twice a day, straighten them, whiten them, treat them like ornaments. But they are bones, exposed to the world. And in the past, they were weak points, chinks in the armor of the human body, through which pain and death could quietly slip. So tonight, as you run your tongue over smooth molars, untouched by decay, let your breath slow. Let your jaw relax. Let your thoughts drift to those who could never sleep without ache, who smiled through pain, who ate on one side, who kissed carefully because even love could hurt the mouth. They didn't write poems about toothaches. They didn't earn statues for enduring them. But they suffered, quietly, every day. And still, they lived, in pain, in silence, in strength. It starts with a cough, not a violent one, not the kind that bends you in half or draws attention in a crowded room. Just a soft clearing of the throat, a dryness, an itch just behind the breastbone. You sip water, you chew mint. It helps, for a moment, but the cough returns, day after day, until one morning there's a fleck of red on the cloth, and that's when you know. It's not just a cough, it's something deeper, darker, a shadow in the lungs, and it has a name: consumption. In the medieval world, death wore many masks, but few were as elegant or as cruel as tuberculosis. It didn't ravage the skin like smallpox. It didn't swell the limbs like plague. It didn't rot the flesh like leprosy. Instead, it whispered, it caressed, it seduced, and then it devoured. They called it the White Death, the sweet sickness, the slow flame. It crept into homes and into blood, into lovers and poets, into song and scripture. It was the disease of the pale and beautiful, of sunken cheeks and bright eyes. of hollow chests and full hearts. It made you fragile. Which, for some, was another word for holy. But there was nothing beautiful about it. Not really. Because tuberculosis, or TB, was a long goodbye. It could take weeks, months, years of slow suffocation. The first symptom was always the cough. Then the weight loss. People with TB seemed to vanish piece by piece. They became shadows of themselves. And yet, their eyes sparkled. That was part of the horror. The fever gave a false glow. Cheeks blushed with heat. Eyes widened in delirium. The sick looked ethereal, but their bodies were crumbling. Inside. You'd see them sitting by windows, wrapped in shawls, always cold. They didn't go to market. They didn't gather at the church. They watched the world from a distance, behind glass, behind fever, behind fate. And the people whispered, "He's fading. She won't last the season." In the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, tuberculosis became almost mythic. It was written about in poems, sung in ballads. It was the illness of poets and lovers because it looked gentle. But that was the trick. TB was no gentle thief. It was a slow executioner. The lungs filled with fluid. The ribs ached. The body wasted away. The muscles devoured by a fire that burned from within. People coughed until they bled. They spat into rags, into bowls, into their hands, and still, the cough came. And there was no cure, not in the Middle Ages, only rest, isolation, and hope. Some believed TB was inherited. Others thought it came from sadness, from heartbreak, from too much passion, a punishment for longing, a reward for beauty. Doctors prescribed dry air, mountain retreats, inhalation of herbs, smoked through clay pipes, milk, cod liver oil, sunlight. But none of it worked, not truly. And yet, some survived, miraculously. They coughed and wasted and nearly died. And then, slowly, returned. We don't know why. Maybe their immune system fought back. Maybe the disease retreated. But they emerged, different, marked, changed. TB didn't just live in the lungs. It scarred the mind, the memory. Families watched each other waste. Mothers nursed sick children who would not grow. Fathers wept over beds where daughters smiled with blood on their lips. And lovers kissed softly, knowing it might be their last. Because TB was intimate, it spread through air, through shared space, through whispered secrets and shared cups. It made you fear the breath of the one you loved. And yet, you loved them still. You held them, even when it burned. There were times when entire families faded, one by one, and the house was sealed, and the neighbors crossed themselves, and the wind blew through the empty rooms, carrying dust and silence. Artists drew pictures of the sick, gaunt, beautiful, dying, their ribs like harp strings, their eyes too large for their skulls, and still, they painted flowers beside them. Because suffering, especially slow suffering, was seen as sacred, a test, a cleansing. But what it really was lonely. TB separated people, not just from society, from each other. The sick were isolated, not always physically, but emotionally, because their death was always coming, and no one knew when. So people pulled back, just a little, a step, a pause, a silence after the cough. But those who stayed, they saw something else, not disease, not decay, but strength. The strength of breathing, even when every breath hurt, of laughing, even when the ribs cracked, of saying, "I'm still here," when the body was ready to give up. And so, in monasteries and villages and cold stone rooms, the TB patients whispered prayers, not always for healing, sometimes just for time, another day, Another morning with light through the window, another touch. Because death was a whisper, but life, even painful life, was a song. Today, TB is treatable. We have medicine, science, hospitals, but we forget the time when it meant certain death, slow, lonely, and quiet. So tonight, breathe deeply. Let your lungs expand. Feel the air move, clean and painless, and remember those who could not, who sipped at the sky like it was a broken cup, who smiled with red lips and hollow cheeks, who said goodbye over and over, but never stopped hoping. They were not all poets, not all lovers. Some were children, mothers, bakers, smiths. Ordinary people dying extraordinarily slowly, but they lived too, before the cough, during it, even at the edge, and that life, however fragile, still mattered. And in the silence after the cough, there was still breath, still story, still soul. The night is still, too still. The fire has burned low, and only a soft orange glow dances along the wooden beams above you. Everyone sleeps. The house is silent, save for the breath of the people you love, the occasional creak of timber, the settling of old stone. And then, it begins. A strange gasp, then a low groan, then chaos. Furniture topples, a bowl crashes to the ground, and before you fully open your eyes, you know. It's happening again. Your brother is having one of his fits. In the Middle Ages, there were few afflictions more feared, or more misunderstood, than epilepsy. It did not come with fever or sores. It did not spread from person to person like the plague or smallpox, but it terrified people all the same, because it came without warning, without pattern, without explanation, and when it arrived, it looked like possession. Imagine, you are 7. You've been healthy your whole life, but one morning, while gathering firewood, you fall. Your limbs jerk uncontrollably. You foam at the mouth. You soil yourself. You lose time. You wake on the ground, face scraped, knees bruised, and you don't know why everyone is staring. They call it many things: the sacred disease, the falling sickness, demon madness, God's fury, the devil's dance, because there is no way to explain it, not in a world without neurology, without MRIs, without even the word seizure. There is only fear. For some, epilepsy was believed to be a divine gift, an opening between the human and the spiritual, a sign that the afflicted could commune with angels or demons. Some saints were said to have it, others were said to cast it out. But for ordinary people, the meaning was much simpler. If you had fits, you were cursed, or marked, or dangerous. And so, like many misunderstood afflictions, epilepsy often led to isolation. Children who seized too often were hidden. Adults who seized in public were feared, shunned, or worse, accused of witchcraft. There was no medication. No diagnostics, only crude restraints and ancient rituals. Some families tied their epileptic loved ones to the bed at night, not in malice, but in desperation, to keep them from biting their tongue, from breaking their bones on the floor, from wandering into fire or out into the cold. And yet, people tried to help. Herbs, prayers, the burning of sage, talismans made from boar's tusks or stones shaped by rivers. They whispered charms over the sleeping bodies. They painted signs above the door. They kept iron near the pillow. Iron repels spirits, they said. And sometimes the fits stopped. But often they didn't. The worst part was not the fit itself. It was the aftermath, the silence that followed, the confusion, the shame, because you did not remember. Only that you were now lying on the floor, your mouth bloodied, your body sore. And everyone was looking. Again. And slowly, you stopped joining them, stopped going to market, stopped speaking much, You stayed in corners, in shadows, not because you feared death, but because you feared being seen. Some became known as simpletons, fools, mad, because epilepsy did not only affect the body, it affected the mind. Some had seizures that dulled memory. That made speech harder. That changed personality. And there was no language to explain this shift, only judgment, only distance. But those who knew, who lived with it, learned their own rhythms. They felt the aura, the strange sensation before a fit, a smell no one else noticed, a tingle behind the eyes, a flash of light inside the skull. And in that moment, they prepared. They sat down, closed their eyes, took a breath, and waited. Because that's all you could do. Wait. In some rare places, epilepsy was treated with compassion. Monasteries took in afflicted children. Villages built small rooms where the sick could rest safely. Midwives and herbalists studied the patterns, wrote down what worked. Some became healers themselves, because pain, when survived, becomes wisdom. And yet, society never trusted them fully. The fear was always near. What if it was catching? What if it was evil? What if they snapped? So they lived at the edge of town, of family, of understanding. But they lived, even when their own bodies betrayed them, even when they woke with bruises and no memory. Even when the world called them cursed, they lived. And some, quietly, steadily, taught the world to see them, to listen, to stop fearing what they didn't understand. It took centuries. It's still happening. But it began there, with one child, one seizure, one mother who didn't give up. So tonight, as your body lies calm and your mind drifts gently into sleep, think of them, the ones who shook, who fell, who woke alone, and kept waking. They were not possessed. They were not broken. They were people, with storms in their blood and light in their eyes. Their screams were real, but so was their strength. In the night, when the world was still, they kept going. Rope burns on the wrists, bite marks on the tongue, terror in the heart, but they rose. Because life is not always still. Sometimes it jerks, it trembles, it collapses, but it continues. And so did they. You notice it first in the mirror, if your home has one. Or maybe in a bowl of still water. A small bump, dark, almost black in the center. At first it doesn't hurt, you press it. Nothing. You scratch it gently. Still nothing. But by evening it's larger, raised, hot. And by morning, your entire forearm is red, stiff, aching. And the center of the sore? It's oozing now. You cover it with a cloth, rub it with herbs, and try not to think about it. But you already know. This is not just a boil. This is something else. Something worse. In the Middle Ages, few things caused more fear than mysterious skin eruptions. Not because they always killed, but because they marked. Because they could start small. A bump, a rash, and then, seemingly overnight, transform into wounds that devoured flesh. And one of the most terrifying of them was carbuncle. But some knew it by another name. Anthrax. Today, we associate anthrax with warfare, with white powder, with laboratories. But back then, it came from something far more ordinary. A cow, a sheep, a contaminated hide, a scratch from a dirty blade used on infected meat. And suddenly, the skin began to change. The black spot. That was the first sign. It looked burned, dead, as if a piece of coal had been pressed into the skin and left there to fester. Then came the swelling, the fever, the muscle pain so deep it felt like your bones were bending, and in many cases, death. Sudden, terrifying, and irreversible. But anthrax was not the only disease of the skin. The Middle Ages were filled with strange afflictions that seemed to crawl across the body. Scabies, ringworm, erysipelas, also known as St. Anthony's fire for the way it burned, impetigo, leprosy, and the catch-all term feared by all, the canker. Any ulcer that spread, that resisted healing, that smelled wrong, it was called canker, and it was considered a slow, rotting death. Imagine being a weaver. You work with wool all day, your hands rough, cracked from the loom. A small cut appears near your thumb. You ignore it. You always do. But this time it doesn't heal. It darkens. The skin around it dies. Your fingers swell. You can't grip the threads. You wrap it. You pray. But your arm aches up to the elbow, and your neighbors start to look at you differently. Because in a world without diagnosis, the body was a mystery. And when skin broke, when it bled or cracked or changed color, that mystery became fear. Was it plague? Was it leprosy? Was it punishment? Or worse, was it contagious? People with skin diseases were often exiled, not just the lepers. Anyone with visible sores could be suspect. Even eczema, even psoriasis, if inflamed enough, might be feared. Children were kept away. Water shared by the afflicted was thrown out, their clothing burned, their homes avoided. But in the quiet, in the corners of the village, they still lived, still hoped, still tried to heal. Herbalists offered remedies: burdock root, crushed and boiled, vinegar compresses, honey, thickly layered to draw out the bad humours, clay from sacred springs, and prayer, always prayer, to saints, to ancestors, to no one in particular. Sometimes it worked. The wound dried, the skin healed, though it scarred. Other times, the infection deepened, and the flesh peeled back from the bone, and the fever rose. And the end came not with a cry, but with a whimper, alone in the dark as the body stopped resisting. And yet, the survivors bore witness. Their skin bore it too: scars, cracks, missing fingers, keloids like ropes down the arms. They were reminders of battles fought on the battlefield of the skin. And they were strong, so strong, because even when the body rots, the will to live often remains whole, even when the pain makes you flinch at every breeze. Even when you're stared at like a walking wound, even when you're called cursed, unclean, doomed, you rise, you eat, you walk, even with a limp. You work, even if no one sees it. You endure. Some turned their pain into healing. Former sufferers became caretakers. They recognized the early signs. They whispered advice in alleyways. They brought salves, not out of duty, but out of knowing. Because once you've watched your own body betray you, you never forget. And when someone else suffers, you see it before anyone else does. Children learn to hide their sores, to wear long sleeves even in heat, to scratch at night so no one heard, to bite their tongues when the itching drove them mad. But when they found each other, there was comfort, a quiet community of the afflicted. They shared herbs, stories, hope. And slowly, over generations, knowledge grew. They noticed which herbs cooled the fire, which poultices dried the wounds, which foods seemed to help, which ones worsened the pain. They didn't call it medicine, they called it survival. So tonight, as you lie in comfort, your skin whole, your body cool, your breath steady, remember them, the ones whose skin turned against them, whose bodies burned without fire, whose fingers twisted, who lost pieces of themselves and still reached for life. They weren't symbols, they weren't metaphors, they were people, scarred, scabbed, soft in the soul, even when their skin cracked open. And they lived, sometimes in shadow, sometimes in shame, but always with courage. Because to live in a body that hurts is a quiet kind of heroism. To wear pain on the outside and keep moving is strength. And to touch another with a wounded hand and offer comfort, that is grace. Their marks weren't curses. They were histories, written in flesh and remembered tonight, by you, in stillness, in breath, in warmth. Their pain lives on, not to haunt, but to honor. Their skin peeled, but their stories remain whole. And in this quiet moment, they are heard again. You're walking home after a long day. The sun has dipped behind the hills, and the sky is that deep blue that comes just before full dark. Your hands are rough from work. Your feet ache in your shoes, but you smile because home is close. And then, in the quiet of the path, you hear it. A rustle in the brush, then a low growl, and before you can turn, it's already on you. Teeth sink into your leg, hot breath, the stench of fur, a flash of eyes too wild to be natural. A dog, maybe. Or something that was once a dog. Now it's foam and fang and fury. You kick, scream, flail, and it runs off. You limp home, blood soaking into your stocking. You wash the wound. You pray. You go to bed. And wait. Because now, all you can do is wait. In the Middle Ages, few diseases terrified more than rabies. It was rare. But it was hell. A small wound, just a bite, could seal your fate. And not today, not tomorrow, sometimes not even next week, but maybe a month from now, or longer, when you least expect it, when the wound has already faded, when you think you've been spared. That's when it begins. It starts with fever, irritability, maybe a sore throat, then fear of noise, of wind, of your own breath, of water. Hydrophobia, that was one of the signs. It doesn't mean you fear water in your mind. It means your throat won't let you swallow it. You try. Your body panics. You spasm. You choke. You convulse. And the terror takes over. In medieval Europe, people didn't understand viruses. They didn't know about the rabies pathogen, but they knew the signs. They had seen it. The madness, the seizures, the frothing at the mouth, the way once kind animals turned feral, the way calm people screamed and bit and thrashed before dying. And there was nothing anyone could do. No treatment. No comfort. No priest who could reach you in the end, because you were already gone, long before death. Imagine being the mother of a bitten child. You watched him play near the barn. A fox, they said. Just a nip. No deep wound. You cleaned it. He smiled. A week passed. He helped you gather eggs. Then, he woke you in the night, sweating, shaking, screaming. He sees things. He bites his own tongue. He begs for water, then shrieks when you bring it close. He howls, and you cry. But there's nothing left to do. Rabies was a death sentence, a theatrical, agonizing, unstoppable descent into madness. They tried everything, hot irons to the bite, salt packed into the wound, honey and ash, herbs boiled in wine, charms made of dog's teeth, spells scratched into wood, priests shouting prayers over the sick, chains, silence, hope. But none of it helped. Once symptoms began, the end was certain, and everyone knew it. They feared animals after that. Not wolves or bears. They already feared those. But dogs, cats, foxes, things that once lived beside you, that might one day carry death in their mouths. People spoke of bewitched animals, of spirits riding beasts, of witches turning into hounds at night, of demons leaping from bite to blood to soul, because how else could a dog's bite make a person go mad? And because it was so rare, it was all the more feared. A quiet terror, lurking, unpredictable. Some towns banned dogs entirely. Others cut the ears of strays to mark them. Some people refused to own animals at all. Others watched theirs like hawks. And when a bite happened? Panic. The bitten were often isolated, locked away. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Because no one knew when it would start. They might be fine today, and tomorrow, foam at the mouth, screaming in voices not their own. It happened. It happened often enough to never be forgotten. And for those who lived through it, who watched a loved one succumb, there was no forgetting. Because rabies wasn't a quiet death. It was a performance of horror. The eyes changed. The breathing grew erratic. The body fought itself. The voice dropped to growls. And sometimes they begged to die. No gentle passing, only frenzy, and then silence. Some believed rabies was a punishment, others a possession, but all agreed it was the worst way to go. It haunted families, haunted towns, turned animals into threats, turned affection, the lick of a dog, the purr of a cat, into uncertainty. And the stories spread, of boys who chased rabbits and died screaming, of girls who kissed puppies and went mad weeks later, of men who tried to hide their wounds until it was too late. Rabies lived in the space between moments, between the bite and the first symptom, between hope and horror. And once it began, it took everything: mind, body, dignity. And yet, even in this, there were stories of grace, of mothers who stayed by their children, of lovers who held hands until the end, of friends who whispered prayers over a convulsing body, even as they trembled, because even the maddened deserve to be mourned. Even those who scream deserve soft words. Even when the soul seems gone, love stays. So tonight, as you drift safely in your bed, no animal near, no wound to worry, think of those who were not so lucky. The ones who trusted a soft bark, a wagging tail, a harmless game in the field, and paid with their minds. Their end was not noble, not poetic. It was raw, ragged, brutal, but they were human, to the very last moment. And we remember them not for their death, but for their fear, their courage, their suffering, and the ones who did not run. In the darkest madness, there was still humanity. In the worst deaths, there were still stories. And tonight, we carry one of them, softly, gently, safely. The cold doesn't warn you. It doesn't arrive like a shout or a scream. Not in the way plague does, not like a sudden fall. It seeps into walls, into wool, into your bones. And one morning, you wake not with fear, but with weight. A heaviness behind your eyes, in your chest, in your breath. You sit up and the air feels wrong, thick. You cough once. It echoes through your ribs. You reach for your cloak, but the cold has already slipped underneath your skin. In the medieval world, few things were more feared in winter than pneumonia. Though they did not call it that, they called it the winter sickness, the lung fever, or the chill that takes the old. It had no name, but everyone knew what it meant. Breath that wouldn't come, skin that turned blue, lips that cracked from dry air and coughing, the quiet suffocation of someone who simply stopped breathing. It was rarely sudden. Pneumonia moved slowly, but decisively. It might start as a cold, just a runny nose, a cough. You work through it. Everyone does. But then your chest aches when you lie down. Your cough deepens, turns wet, then red, and suddenly you can't lie flat. Because if you do, it feels like drowning. There is no ocean in your house, but your lungs are full of water, and every breath becomes a fight. In a time before antibiotics, before oxygen masks, before thermometers, pneumonia was a thief that came in silence. And most often, it came in winter. Fires were not always enough. They smoked, choked, blankets soaked through, windows stayed shut to keep the warmth in, and the air stale. The sick coughed, and the air held it in, and those beside them coughed too. It passed from bed to bed, from child to father, from grandmother to baby. They knew what to do, as best they could. Stew hot onions in cloth, laid on the chest, honey and wine, steam from boiling herbs, prayers. And watching, always watching, because you never knew when a cough would become a death rattle. For the old, it was often final. They had weathered famine, childbirth, war, but pneumonia required no weapon, just time, just cold, just a body too tired to fight anymore. Imagine being 70, a rare age in those days. You've lived through harsh winters, buried friends, survived infection. You feel the chill come early that year. Your joints ache. You try to stay inside. But your grandson has a cough, and you hold him anyway. You always do. And 2 weeks later, you feel it in your chest, a tightening, a pressure, and then you know, this is your last winter. Children too were taken, because their bodies were small, their breaths too shallow. They cried at night, gasped, turned blue, and fell silent before morning. Mothers watched, helpless, rocked them in thick blankets, lit extra candles, begged saints. But sometimes, the flame went out anyway. The death wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, a slow dimming. You'd sit up in bed, head back, mouth open, trying to breathe. You'd cough, and eventually, stop. Those who lived through it bore the memory of lungs never quite the same, of ribs that ached in every winter after, of siblings lost, of nights sitting by the fire, listening to the cough in the next room, praying it wouldn't deepen. Because everyone knew the sound, that shift, that sudden wetness in the breath, that moment when you stopped trying to speak between coughs and just focused on air, in, out, until even that was too much. Some tried to move the sick to warmer places, but travel was harsh, and most couldn't afford it, so they stayed, wrapped the dying in layers, held their hands as they shook, whispered comfort as the lungs gave way. And after, they aired out the room, washed the sheets, opened the windows to let the soul fly out, lit a candle, and carried on. They didn't talk about pneumonia as we do. They didn't have names for lobar versus bronchial, but they knew. They knew the cold could kill. They knew the lungs were fragile, and they feared the cough that never left. Some healers tried to predict who would fall. They said red cheeks were good. A strong back meant more breath, but none of it mattered. Sometimes the healthy died first, and the weak lived on. Pneumonia didn't discriminate. It didn't scream. It whispered. And in that whisper, it won. But some returned. After days of fever, of hallucinations, of pain, they rose, thin, sweaty, exhausted, but alive. And they never forgot what it was like, to fight for each breath, to wonder if you'd wake the next day, to listen for your own heartbeat in the dark. So now, as your chest rises and falls in the quiet of a safe room, listen to that rhythm, that gift, breath, in, out, steady, clean. And remember those who didn't have it, who coughed until the fire dimmed, who reached for air that wasn't there, who died not in fear but in silence, because even breath can betray. But for each who died, another lived and passed down the story of the winter that tried to take them, of the lungs that held, of the heart that kept beating one breath at a time. Their story is soft but vital, like breath, invisible but necessary. And tonight, you carry it, in your sleep, in your lungs, in your quiet gratitude for every breath you take without thinking. They remind us, Life is not loud. It is not always grand. Sometimes it's just one more breath and the will to take it. You sit in the doorway long after the sun has dipped behind the trees. The chickens are silent. The wind has died. The fire in the hearth glows, but you don't feel its warmth. Your hands rest in your lap. You've forgotten what you were doing. Or maybe you weren't doing anything. You haven't moved in hours. You haven't spoken much in days. There's no fever, no wound, no blood. Just this weight behind your eyes. This cloud that no one else can see. And if they ask, and they rarely do, you can't explain it. Not really, because there's no word for it. Not yet. But it lives inside you. And it's growing. In the Middle Ages, not all illnesses marked the skin. Not all screamed through the lungs or rotted the teeth. Some lived quietly, in the mind, in the spirit, in the soul. Today we call them many things: depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, post-traumatic wounds. But back then, they were known only by shadows, melancholia, madness, possession, grief that wouldn't lift. There were those who wept without reason, who stopped eating, who forgot their children's names, who laughed at nothing, who spoke to the wind, who screamed in the night, who stared at walls until someone moved them. And for most, there was no help. They were not taken to doctors. They were not comforted. They were feared, pitied, avoided. A woman who heard voices might be called a prophet, or a witch. A man who wandered the fields at night might be thought cursed, or holy. The line between sickness and sanctity was thin and dangerous. Imagine a young wife who simply stops getting out of bed. Her body is strong. She does not cough. She bears no sores, but her eyes are empty. She eats only when pressed. She no longer sings. The village calls it a phase, then a failing, then a sin. They tell her to pray more, to confess, to cleanse herself. But still, the heaviness clings. Or picture a boy who can't sit still, who fidgets, talks too fast, forgets his chores, interrupts elders, starts to cry without reason. He is called unruly, then possessed, then beaten. But no one sees the storm inside him, because the storm makes no sound, only movement. And then there are the elderly. They begin repeating themselves, wandering, forgetting. Not just names, but places, faces, what bread is, how to open a door, and people say, it's just old age. But they say it with fear, because what if the mind can slip away? What if you can still breathe, but no longer know who you are? And then there were the voices, the visions, people who said they saw saints, angels, demons. In a deeply religious world, this could mean honor or exile. It depended on who believed you and who didn't. For many, mental illness was spiritual, a punishment for pride, a test of faith, a mark of the devil, or a wound carried from another life. They didn't have psychology, but they had judgment, and judgment weighs heavy. Some were chained, to beds, to trees, to chapel walls, not in anger, but in fear, because no one knew what to do. A man who raged in the streets, a girl who refused to speak for a year, a mother who screamed when the church bells rang. They didn't fit, and so they were removed. Others lived quietly, the melancholics, those who faded slowly over years, who lived in silence, in shame, in solitude. They weren't sent away, but they were left behind, because sadness, when too long, becomes invisible. But not all were forgotten. In some places, people understood. If not the illness, then the need. They left food at the door, spoke gently, made space. Let them wander safely. Let them return without question. Healers offered roots, valerian, chamomile, willow bark, sleep, time, touch. And for some, it helped, not because it cured, but because it soothed, because when the soul aches, a warm hand can matter more than any medicine. There were those who survived, not by force, not by conquest, but by endurance, 1 hour to the next, one morning after another, until the fog lifted, if it lifted, and when it did, they remembered. How close they came to forgetting themselves entirely. The world did not understand, but the soul kept going. There are tales of mad kings, of holy fools, of poets who wept for days and wrote for nights, of widows who never spoke again, of children who grew quiet and never grew loud. They were not less. They were simply tuned to a different song, a melody few could hear, a rhythm hard to follow. So tonight, in your calm, as your thoughts settle and your body sinks into comfort, remember them, the ones whose wounds didn't bleed, whose fevers were unseen, whose battles were inside and constant. They were not weak. They were not broken. They were tired of carrying what they couldn't name, of fearing what they couldn't control, of living in a world that didn't yet know how to help them. And yet, they lived. They waited. They hoped, even when it felt hopeless. Their courage was not loud. It did not ride horses or hold swords. It whispered. It breathed. It sat quietly through another night. And now, in this night, we sit with them and listen to the silence, to the ache, to the part of all of us that has known sadness too heavy to hold alone. And we hold it, together, for them, for us, for the long line of souls who've suffered in silence and survived anyway. The knock on the door is soft, measured, no urgency, but not calm either. You rise, heart already heavy, and open it to find him standing there, tall, wrapped in black, gloves like leather shadows, and that mask, long, beaked, empty-eyed, not human, not bird, not quite real, and yet, all too real. The plague doctor has arrived, and that means someone inside, maybe everyone inside, is dying. In the Middle Ages, to be a doctor was to live in the constant presence of death, but to be a plague doctor, that was something else entirely. It meant walking willingly into infection. It meant touching bodies that others wouldn't approach. It meant watching entire neighborhoods vanish, street by street, house by house, and still returning the next day. But let's not pretend these doctors were saints. Some were brave, others were desperate for coin, many were barely trained, some were simply the only ones who didn't flee. And what tools did they have? Not scalpels or antibiotics, but beaks filled with lavender, mint, rose petals, camphor, anything strong enough to mask the stench, and, they hoped, the disease. They believed in miasma, bad air. They thought the plague floated in smells, seeped through pores, lingered in mist. So they stuffed their masks with herbs, sealed their robes, tied their gloves, and waded into sickness. The mask wasn't for fear, it was for survival, and for many, it didn't work. Some carried canes, not just for walking, but for prodding the sick. They did not always touch with hands. They used sticks to examine, to lift sheets, to test for breath, not out of cruelty, but because they knew touch could kill. And when they entered a home, they did what they could, marked the walls, measured the pulse, wrote the names of the dead, burned incense, said prayers, left quickly, and walked on to the next. They were not saviors, they could not cure, but they bore witness, and in a world dying quietly, that mattered. Their robes were sometimes waxed, to resist fluids. Their faces were hidden. Their presence was a symbol of help, of fear, of the thin line between life and death. Children feared them. Some thought they were spirits. Others saw them as the last face you'd ever see, and often they were. Imagine being 10 years old. Your mother coughs. You sit beside her, holding her hand. Then she grows quiet, and the doctor comes. You hide, because that mask does not promise safety. It promises the end. Doctors in the Middle Ages were not as we imagine today. They were readers of stars, collectors of herbs, students of ancient texts. Not all agreed on how the body worked. Some believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Illness, they said, was an imbalance. Too much heat, too little moisture. So they bled patients, fed them specific foods, applied leeches, wrapped them in cloth soaked in vinegar. And sometimes it helped. Not because of the method, but because of rest and care and the will of the body to live. But often it didn't. The doctors argued, with each other, with priests, with the sick. Some believed in astrology, others in scripture. Some said bathhouses spread disease, others said they healed. There was no consensus, only chaos. And yet, people still called for them, even when they had no cure, even when they wore masks that looked like death itself, because hope is stubborn. And in a world of grief, even a gloved hand reaching into the dark is something. Some doctors were women, not formally trained, but wise. They knew the plants, the cycles, the signs. They helped the dying die with less pain, and the living live with a little more ease. Others were monks, healers of soul and body. Their remedies came with prayers, their salves with psalms. And some were simply brave, ordinary people who refused to leave the sick alone, who dressed the wounds, boiled water, held hands, watched the light fade from eyes again and again, and still showed up the next morning. Not all wore masks, not all had robes, but they were doctors all the same. And for those who survived, those whose fever broke, whose breath returned, the doctor was a figure of legend, the one who came through the smoke, who walked past the dead and left behind a tincture, a word, a chance. They were flawed, sometimes foolish, often afraid. But they stood between humanity and the abyss, and they stood for longer than they had to. So tonight, as you rest in a world full of medicine and masks made by science, think of them. The ones who stitched their own gowns, who mixed herbs by moonlight, who burned spices not for scent, but for safety. The ones whose faces no one saw, but whose presence meant you are not alone. They couldn't stop the plague, or the fever, or the bleeding, but they could be there. And sometimes that was enough. Because in the worst moments, the most terrifying ones, presence matters more than cure. And in the end, that's what they gave. Their presence, their fear, their flawed hope. We don't know all their names, but we know their shape. The silhouette in the fog, the long coat, the mask like a bird's skull, the shadow that entered the house and didn't run away. And tonight, we honor them, not with praise, but with memory, with breath, with rest. They were not perfect, but they were there, and in history, being there is everything. You're sick, not just tired, not just sore from work, but truly sick. The kind that makes your skin hot and your bones cold. The kind where your thoughts flicker like candlelight in the wind. You've tried herbs, warm wine, cold cloths. You've whispered prayers. You've slept for days. And still, it grows worse. And so, someone tells you to visit her, the one who lives just beyond the edge of the village. The one whose door is marked with bundles of dried sage. The one some call healer, and others call witch. In the Middle Ages, medicine did not live only in monasteries or behind masks. It lived in forests, in kitchens, in quiet rooms with smoke rising from pots of bitter herbs. It lived in faith, and in folklore. Because when sickness came and doctors failed and nothing logical remained, people turned to what might work, to anyone who could help. The curandera, the herbalist, the wise woman, the midwife with a knowing look and a hand that soothed. These were the healers of the people, sometimes sanctioned, often feared, always needed. They knew the plants, not just names, but seasons, roots, the way leaves curled when they were potent. They brewed teas for coughs, packed wounds with moss, laid fevered heads on pillows soaked in lavender and willow bark. They burned sage to clear the air, used garlic to draw out illness, tied red thread around wrists to ward off bad spirits. And they listened, more than anyone else did, to the sighs, to the silences, to the things patients couldn't say to priests or physicians. And sometimes they succeeded. People walked away better. Fevers broke, coughs softened, spirits lightened. So others came, desperate, fearful, hopeful. They brought coins, chickens, wool, anything they had, because healing was worth anything. And when nothing else worked, faith worked. Even if just enough to breathe easier. But not all healing came from herbs. Some came from the church, from relics, from bones encased in gold, from water touched by saints, from hands laid by men in robes. They believed, and belief was its own medicine. They pilgrimaged to holy wells, touched stones that cured blindness, kissed icons that promised strength, bathed in springs said to purify blood, carried crosses made from wood that once touched a holy martyr, and for some, it worked. Because healing isn't always in the body. Sometimes it's in hope, in permission to believe you might be well, in the soft glow of candlelight on ancient altars, in the sound of a hymn rising in a sick room. But others sought protection, not just healing. They wanted prevention. So they hung herbs above doors, kept salt in corners, slept with iron beneath their pillows, avoided crossroads at night, avoided strangers with strange eyes. Because illness wasn't just physical. It was supernatural, a curse, a bad wind, the evil eye. And healers responded in kind. They buried offerings, scratched symbols on doorframes, said charms in languages no one else spoke, drew circles in the dirt, and sometimes simply sat beside the sick and hummed old lullabies. Children were especially believed to be vulnerable. Mothers tied amulets around their necks, painted symbols on cribs, fed them tiny portions of protection herbs, and prayed, constantly, that no spirit would steal their breath in the night. It sounds strange now, but back then, everything was strange. The body was mysterious, the world was dangerous, and the line between science and story didn't exist, only survival did. So when your neighbor burned rosemary at twilight, you didn't ask why. You did the same. When your grandmother told you to never sweep the house after dark, you obeyed. Because what if she was right? What if that was the thing that kept the cough away? And some healers walked both worlds. They knew the herbs and the saints. They read the stars and the psalms. They whispered to the sick and to the Virgin Mary. They were not scholars, but they were necessary. When plague came, people went to them before they went to doctors, because they would listen, hold hands, stay, even if nothing could be done. And sometimes, something happened. Not a miracle, but a shift, a fever breaking, a child breathing steady again, a man opening his eyes after a week of silence. And no one could explain it, but no one questioned it. Because when life returns, even a little, you don't need an answer, only breath. But not everyone approved. The church sometimes accused them of heresy, of meddling with dark forces, of healing without holy permission. Some were exiled, others punished, a few burned. because healing was power. And power, in the wrong hands, was dangerous. But the people remembered. They whispered names in secret, passed recipes from mother to daughter, wrote charms into cookbooks, folded remedies into lullabies. Because knowledge, once lived, does not vanish. It rests in the bones. And now, centuries later, we still do it. We sip chamomile for sleep. We burn candles when someone is sick. We call our mothers when we're unwell, just to hear their voice. Because healing is still ritual, still comfort, still part story. So tonight, as you lie warm, your breath calm, your thoughts soft, remember them. The ones who healed with touch, with song, with soup, with silence, with presence. The ones who said, "Let me stay a while," and did. They were not gods, not always right, not always pure, but they were there, and sometimes that was enough. Their herbs have faded, their charms forgotten, their homes long gone, but their warmth, it lingers. In the way we still hope, still reach, still believe that sickness can pass, that healing can come, that presence matters, that stories can mend, and that even when the world forgets their names, their care lives on. In you, in me, in this breath, right now.